Hey, welcome everyone to Ground Truth, our podcast. This is the podcast where John and I will talk about the latest events in AI and go over the last week and just make sure we're staying current and providing context on some of the new events. A little bit about me. My name is Adam Wenchel. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Arthur. And I've been in AI for a long time, 25 years, in fact. I followed one of my college professors over to DARPA, worked on a couple early influential DARPA AI projects, including control of agent-based systems. And from there, have been working in the tech world, in the startup world primarily ever since. My last startup was acquired by Capital One, where I ended up starting and leading their AI team for a few years. And then I left to start Arthur. And we work with a number of quite a few clients from innovative startups all the way to some of the leading enterprises that are transforming themselves with AI, and so we have a really good perspective on both the theory and the real world state of AI right now. And excited to dive in and hopefully provide some helpful context to folks looking to really get their head around AI topics and how to apply them in the real world.
Yeah, Adam, it's exciting to see agents coming back around. DARPA's been thinking about agents for quite a long time. The AI community has as well. So cool to be chatting with an OG agent person.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a while. It's amazing. Back then, it didn't really work, but it was fun to think about. We were happy when it just worked in a demo. So it's exciting to see these things actually start to create real world value.
Yeah, both positive and negative.
Yeah. So John, you want to give us a little bit on? You have a cool background too.
Yeah, so I'm John, chief scientist here at Arthur. I'm also a tenured faculty member at the University of Maryland, which is sort of in the DC world, kind of the Brooklyn of DC, if you look at geography there. Done a lot of work in market design, so the use of machine learning and optimization for the design of economic mechanisms. Think like platform matching markets like an Uber or like a YouTube, or think auctions like, advertising auctions are a big one. They drive the internet economy. And so been working in that space for quite a long time, and then also in sort of the robustness and fairness space, which has intersected quite a bit with Arthur. And so throughout that career, I've ended up working on some very interesting problems in things like organ allocation, like the meaty bits inside of you. How do you get those to the right people to save lives? Worldwide blood donation, actually with Meta. We'll be talking about Meta quite a bit today due to their recent releases, and then those more sort of standard markets like combinatorial auctions and so on to make money. So really looking forward to chatting with Adam and hopefully some of our audience over the coming weeks about what's going on in AI broadly.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in. The big stories this week, a lot of them really centered around some major announcements in the open source model world from some interesting players. So John, you want to start us off?
Yeah, for sure. So one that was completely unexpected on my side is Apple released a relatively small 7B model, which is open source in the sense that it's open weights, as in I can download the model from the internet, but also open source in the sense that I can see what training data was used as well. So I believe that they just used open data there. So I'm not sure if they released the optimizer that they used for this model, but you could arguably recreate this model on your own if you wanted to. And I say this is surprising to me because it's Apple, right? Apple is famously just a giant sort of black box walled garden, and they've really been quiet in the AI race up until in some sense their recent announcement that they're partnering somewhat with OpenAI to do AI first sort of iPhone activities that should come out probably on the next iPhone, and then They're really focusing unsurprisingly, on edge style computing. So this is a small model that they released, right? They're looking to be able to run this, on a laptop or on a phone, right? And they've been building their own sort of custom silicon for the deployment of AI on these devices as well. I'm on a MacBook right now that runs native code very, very nicely, and we're very excited to see Apple finally waking up in this space and starting to release actual models.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be cool to see. The next iPhone announcement is about 2 months away, roughly,
Yep.
And so people are expecting a big emphasis on AI in the silicon, and they've already announced some of the iOS features that are going to be taking advantage of it. So exciting to see.
Yeah, I mean, people will maybe upgrade their phone for once. I know, I'm on an Android. I'm an Android person, but like most of my friends are on iPhones, and I don't think they even know what version of iPhone they're on at this point. So maybe this will be a spike for that.
Absolutely. Cool. And it's not just Apple releasing open source models, right? Mistral, which is a major French producer of LLMs, probably, would you say, the leading European open source LLM company? I would, right? And they've released their Mistral Large 2, which is their latest model. So it's 123 billion parameters, 123B, and really has some really strong performance in a few areas, such as coding, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, if you go to their website and look at their benchmarks, they're claiming to beat Llama 3.1 405B, which we haven't talked about yet, on code generation and on some forms of math performance. Now, obviously, they're going to do a little bit of cherry picking on the benchmark, but if you go to a website such as like livebench.ai, you'll see that it's performing extremely well, actually across the board. But I would say, again, on sort of the code and symbolic reasoning and math, it's really doing a great job. And it's unsurprising in the sense that like they did a lot of training on specifically those data sets, and so it's cool to see that model come out and really, arguably dominate other open source models and many closed source models in those spaces.
Yeah, it is cool, and it's really interesting to see the open source LLM and closed source, the way it's evolving, and sort of the importance people are putting on the geopolitical lines and kind of national capabilities around it. So Mistral seems to have be getting a lot of interest from the EU in particular.
Yeah, it's really, really cool. And, they've released a couple of other interesting models in the last week and a half in the coding space as well, smaller models. So one called CodeStroll, which I think is a 22B model, so much smaller than Mistral Large 2, which was just released, like Adam mentioned, 123B. So 22B, you can run that pretty easily on hardware that you and I can afford. And this one outperforms some very, very strong models, like one of the smaller DeepSeek coders, which is known to be extremely strong in coding. And the one that I'm most excited, actually, not in terms of performance, but just because it's a totally different type of model that they released, is something called CodeStroll Mamba. Now, the Mamba there is talking about a state space model, or an SSM model, something called Mamba, that was introduced by researchers out of CMU earlier this year. So when it comes to attention and transformer models, one of the biggest issues in scaling up context window lengths is the quadratic scaling that occurs with the length of that context when you're running attention. And there's been a lot of work in trying to trim that down, using like flash attention, which is a very sort of hardware specific way to optimize some of this, and some other sorts of approximation methods that allow you to like only look in a local neighborhood around a particular set of tokens and so on. But there's a fundamentally different style of approach to this problem, which is a different architecture, something called a Mamba or state space model architecture, which was released by folks out of CMU maybe 6, 7, 8 months ago. Mistral released the second, I believe, industrial version of this style of model. The first was released by AI21, something called Jamba that they released. This was a Mamba style model that was hooked into a traditional transformer model. Mistral released CodeStroll Mamba, which I believe is just a pure Mamba play. So it's a smaller model. Performance isn't incredible or anything like that, but it's one of the first sort of glimmers of hope that we're not just going to be using transformer style models to achieve greatness in the space of AI. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, that is cool. It's amazing to see people, all the new architectures and innovation that is there. Very cool.
Yeah. And now let's get to maybe the
big
dog,
the big news
of the week. Zuck and his friends at Meta released the much anticipated 405B Llama 3.1 model, along with an 8B and a 70B model. So the Llama herd, if you will, of models, they've been playing around with these for quite a long time. Llama 1, way back in the day, was a huge breakthrough in open models, performance that really drove a lot of open source developments, smaller models that were running on your laptop that you could play around with, larger models that were arguably competitive against the opaque models of the time. Now, Llama 3.1 is incredible. So if you look at benchmarks for especially the 405B model, it's beating some of the top models like GPT-4o in particular areas. It's arguably on par with GPT-4o and with Claude Sonnet 3.5. Those are still, if I had to rank them, they're still a little bit better than 3.1 405B, but they're definitely competitive. So this is, I would say the first real time that open source frontier models exist. And so huge credit to Meta and to Zuckerberg's leadership there on releasing these models. You're already seeing people, quantizing these, running them, on devices that really just ugly things like hooking together 23 Mac Minis using Exa to do 405B inferencing and things like that. So I'm super pumped about that.
Yeah, because this model we were looking before the episode. It takes a decent amount of horsepower to run this. I know we were looking at someone running it in the cloud on 8 4090s, and the performance was less than snappy out of the box. But like you said, there's a lot of optimizations that can be done.
Yeah, the 70B model, that sort of middle of the pack model is, and 70B is a size that we've been using for quite a long time in the community. It's kind of a medium-sized model, open source model. Performance on that is absolutely incredible. And so for a lot of these use cases, you may not even need to use a 405B. You can use maybe a quantized 70B, which is going to run very quickly. And the hardware to do that is set up by a lot of academic groups, by a lot of industrial groups already to do that. So I think in the coming days, hours even, we're going to see a lot of really cool applications.
Yeah, is there sort of thoughts around the types of applications that that would actually benefit from this massive model? I mean, is it like things that require more advanced reasoning or multi-step reasoning, agent-based operation? Like when is it like worth investing in that kind of horsepower?
Yeah, I mean, this is the same sort of question that you would have when you're arguing against like GPT-4o versus GPT-4o mini, or one of the larger Anthropic models versus a smaller Anthropic model. This all comes out to evaluation, and for a lot of these smaller models, if they're opaque, I would say you end up having to use a GPT-4o because you can't easily, for example, fine-tune, or you can't easily, for example, distill down to a smaller model. Because you don't own the model. One of the most exciting things I see for the 405B coming out is literally this distillation process. And for those who don't know what that is, it's basically saying, hey, I have access to a really, really smart model, GPT-4o or 405B. I'm going to use that to train a smaller model in such a way that it can kind of ask the teacher particular questions and then scoot itself toward an answer. It's asking something much smarter than a lot of questions, and then you're going to end up having this model that's much, much smaller and very, very good at a specific task. And so I think we're going to see a lot of open models being distilled basically from a 405B and then put into, like we were talking about with Apple, like Edge, run on your phone, run on a Raspberry Pi, whatever. Yeah,
it's super fascinating. I think one of the most fascinating parts about the release too has been how personally Zuck has gotten involved, and if you follow him on social media at all.
On track to reach our goal of becoming the most used AI assistant in the world by the end of the year.
He was posting blog posts, video messages around this, and it's clear he's very invested in it. I think it's been a long time since we've seen the tech titans kind of very personally jostling for relevance and really trying to drive the direction of the technology world. I mean, probably, maybe the mobile race, but even and the cloud computing races are the closest thing that comes to mind. But even then, I feel like in each of those, it was a kind of a subsegment of the tech titans who were involved. Whereas the AI race, it just feels like everyone is throwing their hat in the ring to do battle.
Yeah, I mean, and I gotta say, I wouldn't want to battle any of them. Well, Zuck, especially physically, is much stronger than I am, as well as much richer. But
so your money's on Zuck in the Elon Zuck MMA battle?
Unquestionably, yes. Although I don't want to be. But no, it's been cool to see. For example, University of Maryland alum Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders of Google, being famously now like hands-on keyboard again with AI at Google, and that's amazing to see. Zuck obviously is. Just incredible in terms of being, it's a founder-led company through and through at Meta, and then obviously folks like Satya at Microsoft, terrifying in a different way. What he's done at Microsoft is absolutely incredible.
Yeah. So here's my question. I mean, right now these companies are, how much do you think they're spending on their current models? Probably like in the hundreds of millions of dollars range for like a Meta.
Yeah, I mean. Meta is investing a lot, right?
Yeah.
A lot of money in AI, and some of that obviously goes directly into NVIDIA's stock price. But if I had to guess, it would be probably billions, honestly, when you think about it. When it comes down to salaries, and well, obviously billions when it comes to the investments they made in their data centers. For a specific model, yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me now if we had already crossed the $1 billion mark for 405B.
Yeah, and so in OpenAI, there's all sorts of rumors about them moving into like, the next generations of their models costing in the billions and then tens of billions. They're already sort of laying the groundwork for those types of investments in future generations of models. And so, these companies that are open sourcing it, my question is like, if they don't have a monetization strategy that's tied directly to it, like, is there a point where it's hard for them to keep up? Which is it's hard to even like imagine, Meta struggling to keep up with anyone. But it's an interesting, interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, there's two kind of bets here, right? One is that these models will keep getting bigger and bigger and will stay as expensive to train because we're not seeing fundamental breakthroughs in an H100 to an H200, that kind of thing. And I think this is still going to happen until, it's more evident, if that ever happens, but I think it will, that we're seeing a tapering off effect. It could also be the case, for example, coming back to those Mamba style models or whatever, that we're going to see new architectures that allow us to scale more efficiently. So allow a much, much larger model that still has performance that would, correlate with like a transformer-based, 10 trillion parameter model, but you're actually able to train it because of, for example, dropping some of these quadratic laws or whatever. So fundamental advances there. One of the issues here, though, is, hardware has been built at this point catered specifically to transformer architectures, and so it's increasingly difficult to create new models that outperform on specific, present day hardware, the kind of models that we've started using, these transformer style models. So yeah, when it comes to like who can build these things, there's a case to be made that like there will only be 2 or 3 companies that have the money to build these, right? And you may have to hook into US government style funding for this as well, right? Like at some point, if you're spending $100 billion to train GPT-7 or GPT-8 or whatever, like that is a lot of money. And JPAL is not going to print infinite amount of money to support an ecosystem of 10, 15, 20 frontier model companies at that state. Now the other side of this, right, is like there's a lot of performance in smaller models. We mentioned distillation for creating smaller models. I think there's a lot of differentiation that can be done there. But again, for these big guys, like, $1 billion, $10 billion, $100 billion, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money. It's staggering. So it'll be amazing to see how this plays out over the next couple of years. I'm curious as to, making this kind of relevant to the business world, like how far are we from seeing, technology companies and enterprise really take these models and start to power applications that are people are interacting with? Like I feel like we're seeing it in kind of, we're beginning to see a little bit of it among certain late stage startups and things like that. Like how long do you think till this becomes a lot more mainstream, harnessing the power of these open source models?
Yeah, soon, I think, right? And this is again going to there's this greater question of what applications in this space, not talking about open versus closed source models, but in this space in general, have net positive ROI for enterprises and for companies. But conditioned on that, I would say, these open models are going to allow you to, again, like understand, you'll be able to fine tune your own model and run it without doing 4 times the token pricing that you would need to do if you were fine tuning like an OpenAI style model, right? There's obviously an upfront cost to doing something like fine tuning like that and hosting your own model, but if you can do this and find a smaller model that outperforms, one of these frontier models for tasks that you have, and you spend that one-time upfront cost to do fine-tuning, then over time, your cheaper inferencing, it's going to be faster, cheaper, you're going to understand it more, et cetera. That's going to amortize that cost and eventually, potentially, return net positive ROI relative to using an OpenAI or an Anthropic. And so right now, there's still a technical lift for doing that. There will always probably be a reasonable technical lift for doing that. You have to curate data. If you talk to anyone who trains these models, it's all about the data at the end of the day. You have to be able to train one of these models, and then you have to actually be able to, set it up for inferencing. But that barrier to entry is dropping very, very quickly, in part because there's so much money in the space, and in part because there's so many people working on it as well. And so, Adam, as you know, when we talk to some of our enterprise customers, a lot of them will say things like, hey, we're spinning up something in prod right now that just hits a GPT 3.5, or I guess now it's 4.0 mini or whatever, which is the easiest thing to do. You're doing that in like an Azure OpenAI cloud. But they all say things like, hey, like we're not comfortable with this. We'd love to be running our own models, especially in the regulated space. They want to know exactly what data went into a model. They want to be able to interrogate it. A lot of folks moving into like the mechanistic interpretability work need to have white box access to their models to be able to deal with things like alignment. So I think, this year, we're going to start seeing some of these.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. We are starting to see applications, generative AI-driven applications, hit significant enough scale where that level of optimization is really compelling from an ROI perspective, and they're becoming more existentially important to operations of some large companies, and so that level of control and optimization you can have on them. I agree. It's going to become increasingly important. So it's exciting to see such amazing foundational models come out.
I just want to bring up one other thing that we didn't actually mention here, which is going to drive a lot of money going into these still, which is multimodality, right? So what multimodal means is we're going to have more than just, say, text in, text out. You might have text in, image out, such as like a Stable Diffusion style of model that we've all played around with. Or you might have, in the case of something like a Meta, you might have in their image bind model 6 different modalities, which are part of the input and output, right? This is going to be like images / videos, text, audio, thermal, depth mapping. So this is roughly like how far away things are from, for example, LiDAR on a self-driving car, or say you're wearing an Oculus, how far away something is from your face, as well as what is effectively accelerometer data. And so this is a single model trained on all of those modalities that is super, super exciting to see. And so I think it's very hard to predict even what kind of applications that this might open up, both on the enterprise and the startup side, but we're going to start seeing those. I mean, we already are with image to text, but we're going to start seeing a lot more of those in the coming year.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the early models are largely based on sort of stitched together single modality models that people have been able to graph together to form a multimodal model. But I think there's also sort of more fundamental, training from scratch approaches to that too. And I'm curious, that seems like it would be something that would, really drive up the cost if you're training across, different forms of data, and drive the expense. So I'm curious how you see that playing out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, all of these companies that are training are spending an enormous amount of money on data centers, and that's not just H100, H200s, right? That's a lot of storage. When it comes to like data cleaning, compare all the video that you might imagine all of the Teslas in the world are currently sniffing up as they drive around. If I store that in even a reasonably uncompressed or reasonably not compressed format, that's going to be bigger than the internet relatively quickly. And there's a lot of information encoded in that, so training is going to be very difficult. And hey, that's just talking about video. We're not talking about depth mapping or thermal or whatever. There's so much information that is out there that one could imagine jamming into one of these multimodal models if one can store the data, access the data clean, and actually train the thing. So, a lot of very interesting work in this space. And, we mentioned self-driving cars. We mentioned, Meta released this image bind model open source, and you can imagine, they're interested in the Oculus, or Adam, you were mentioning earlier, before we started the podcast, they're Ray-Bans, right? They're very interested in running these things also on the edge. And so having small models that are then distilled from larger foundation multimodal models is going to be very interesting moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so predictions for the future. This is the part where basically we love to make predictions and then 6 months later laugh at all the things that actually happened, which oftentimes are the Venn diagram of our predictions and what actually happens. So we're hopefully there's a little bit of overlap in that. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. But yeah, any big predictions around open source models and where this is going?
Yeah, I guess 2. So one is, I think we're going to see a lot more specifically Mamba-based models coming out from other players, and they're going to perform increasingly well in spiky tasks to start with. So you're not going to see the GPT-4o beater Mamba model, but you might see like CodeStroll, I think, is a good example of this out of Mistral. It's doing a very good job. And so that's one. I think we're going to see, I'll just throw a number out there, 6 more CodeStroll level of interesting Mamba-based models come out, let's say, by the end of the year. And so that might be from Meta, that might be from OpenAI, even if they tell you what they're doing behind the scenes. Microsoft is doing some really cool work in the open space as well. That's one. And just dawns on me, actually, Microsoft is now publicly developing their own 400B model with the folks from DeepMind that they scooped up and folks in that AI structure, and so that'll release at some point, and it'll be interesting to see how that competes against Meta's 400B. Yeah, that's one. I don't know. What about you, Adam?
Well, the thing that I'm really curious about now, obviously, there's going to be a new administration coming in 6 or 7 months, and as these really powerful models are released, there's a lot of talk about export controls, and it's like while there's a lot of enthusiasm for open sourcing them and putting them in the hands of researchers and companies to give people more control, that also when you consider the sort of geopolitical implications of giving access to this kind of technology as it gets more advanced, it's certainly becoming more and more talked about. And so I am very interested to see. My prediction is at some point there's going to be some sort of pause on people open sourcing these models mandated by the U.S. government, and while people kind of think through the implications of this, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, this obviously is going to depend on who is in office, right, next year. If you read like the open source AI is the path forward, this is the Zuckerberg manifesto that came out with the Llama herd that was just released. He takes on the topic of open source and specifically calling out sort of the obvious elephant in the room, which is China, and makes the case for no export controls. Right, the idea is basically we're going to have these models exfiltrated no matter what. If you go into any tech company, like these tech companies outside of maybe OpenAI at this point aren't set up to operate as secure companies, it would be pretty easy for, and there have been many cases of this happening already, nation states to exfiltrate. I think he uses the phrase on a thumb drive, models on a thumb drive, back to whatever country is doing that espionage. And so I roughly agree with this, by the way. So I think we should not be making a statement here. I think we should not be putting these in export control. But toward your prediction, I could see something like that happening for sure.
Yeah, I think Zuck's premise, like if Meta, there certainly are, those companies are capable of locking things down. There are things that they have that are locked down, and so whether they, right now they may not be operating that way, but that doesn't mean they couldn't if they had to.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see that change.
Yeah.
Here's another prediction. Yeah, so a company that we very rarely mention, AMD. I think this year they're going to do a good thing. I don't know exactly what that is, but I think this year they're going to release something awesome, or they're going to, see some return on like some of the Triton investment that they're doing to try and combat CUDA, or hopefully maybe they'll release a really cool model. I don't know. I'm bullish on AMD. I've loved AMD since I was overclocking computers in my teens with like the Athlon XP and so on. Just a great company in general. They've been very quiet, obviously, in this sort of AI race relative to NVIDIA. This is their year. I'm bullish.
I'm with you, man. I've been, I've had AMD stock for a long time, and I've also overclocked a few AMD home-built computers in my day. So I couldn't agree more. In being a low-key fanboy about them, I think what we need to see first and foremost is a significantly increased investment in the developer ecosystem. That seems to be like the biggest thing kind of holding them back right now. And then there's some smaller things. Their chips, I think, from what we've heard from people who value them, are actually quite good. But these things like the interconnects and packaging for data centers, there's some work to be done there. All right, that's a wrap on the first episode of Ground Truth. Look forward to next week's edition.
Cool. Yeah, we'll be releasing these every Friday, so do get in touch and listen next week.
All right, thanks everyone.